this time, we give back a portion of that to you. It's in your Son's name we pray these things. Amen. All right, let me grab my table real quick. So, speaking of change, we're doing a series today. We're kicking off a series today on worship. And change is actually in the subtitle of the series. We're doing a series called So Will I, Changing the Way We Worship. And I want to go ahead and get something out of the way early, and that is that this series is not what you think it's about. So whenever we've been conditioned, if you've been in church for any length of time, you've been conditioned to think that any worship series is going to be about how we worship, because pretty much all the worship sermons and messages you've heard are about that. When I was growing up, every time the preacher was going to talk about worship, it was going to be about what we do on Sunday, and we're going to talk about the different acts of worship, or we're going to talk about the things we should be doing in worship, or the things we shouldn't be doing in worship, or we're going to talk about changes to the worship style and the service and those kinds of things. That's not what this series is about. Okay, we're not going to talk as much about how we worship as we are about who we worship and why we worship. I do want to change the way we worship here at Murray Hills. I do. We're continually trying to change the way we worship, but we do that not by changing the order. We do 5 songs instead of 4, or whether we use hymnals instead of projection, or whether we use buckets instead of trays. Whatever. I mean, it's not. Those are kind of superficial changes to a worship service. I want to change the way we worship by focusing more clearly and consistently on God, because that's how we change the way we worship. We change the way we worship by moving our hearts and minds to God, who He is, what He's done, and why He is worthy of our worship. And so that's what this series is about. What we're going to do is I've got 2 books that are kind of my primary source material for this, besides the Bible. And you're welcome to pick them up and read them. I always tell you this stuff because everybody's got Google in their pockets, so they can easily pull out and say, wow, he's using Louis Giglio's material. Yes, I am. Okay, I'm telling you right here, I'm using a book by Louis Giglio called The Air I Breathe, Worship as a Way of Life. And the other one is Jeff Deyo's book, Awakening Pure Worship, Cultivating a Closer Friendship with God. And so both of those books kind of helping me with the outline of this series and with the definition of worship that we'll get to a little bit later in this series. But basically, we're just going to be asking a series of questions about worship. What is worship? Why do we worship? Who do we worship? We will talk a little bit about how, but that's not the focus of the series. The focus is more on God and who He is. So today the question is, what is worship? Because it's not as clear as we think. When we say worship, we tend to think different things. Like usually we're trained to think worship, Sunday morning service. That's usually what we're trained. So what is worship? Sunday morning service. We call this the worship center. So we're probably to blame for some of that. We say, I'm going to worship. We say worship was good this morning. We say, boy, Scott was really into worship this morning. So we tend to think worship is Sunday morning experience. But it's become popular the last couple of decades for preachers to say, worship is not about Sunday. Worship is about every day of the week. And I agree with that, and that's true. But what does that mean? So, I've heard many, many preachers say worship is all of life. And I'm going to say something kind of like that in today's message. But what does that mean? That's always, worship is just all of life. What in the world are we talking about? So I hope by the end of today's message, you walk away with at least a definition of what worship is. And yes, it is about Sunday. And yes, it is about all of life. But I want to walk away with a definition. But before we get to it, I want to talk about 2 truths of worship. And this will kind of set the stage for the rest of the series. And we're going to do this for the entire month of November. We'll talk through these. But the 2 core truths are this. The first one is this one. Worship is the first responsibility of the church. Worship is the first responsibility of the church. And I don't know if you've ever heard that before. Maybe you've heard it before. But we don't usually talk about church in that way. When we talk about the first responsibility of the church, we usually talk about evangelism, or we usually talk about discipleship. And so, this idea that worship is the first responsibility of the church is to be a worshiping community. Now, I heard this 2 weeks ago from this stage. I wasn't here, but Rubel was here, and we did one of our swaps, and I was preaching at the Spring Hill campus, and he was here at the Columbia campus, and he told me, hey, I know you're getting ready to do your worship service or series, So I'll set it up. And I'm like, okay, great. So I figured Monday morning I ought to listen to the setup to make sure he knows what he's talking about. And so I did. Now, I'm just kidding. I did listen to it. And I was running on a Monday morning listening to Rubel's message that he preached at this campus. And he said this within the first minute of the message, that the first responsibility of the church is to worship. And I remember the wheels starting to spin like, well, yeah, I think it is. But where does he get... I need to think about that. And that was kind of my reaction to the first part of that message. And so I went back and listened to it a second time. When I wasn't running, wasn't trying to avoid cars and stuff, I went back and listened to the message a second time. And that's exactly what he said. And I think he's exactly right. I want to show you the clip in case you missed it. This was from 2 weeks ago here. And it's just a little 30-second clip of what he said about this.
Historically, if anyone had asked, I was trained to give the following response to this question. What's the first responsibility of the church? Evangelism. That's wrong. The first responsibility of the church is not evangelism. Now, it is a responsibility of the church, but it comes later down the way. The first responsibility of the church is to be a worshiping community. The first responsibility of the church is to put the glory and the joy of the Lord on display before a watching world. The first responsibility of the church is to exhibit the difference that's made in living under the lordship of Christ. Because
okay, so I had to cut him off there real quick, but I did this morning right before church. But the first responsibility is worship. I was trained in the same way that Rubel was to say, no. The first responsibility is evangelism. Or at least the first responsibility is discipleship. Or maybe both. It's evangelism and discipleship. And the reason we were trained to say that is because Jesus said what we call, now Jesus didn't Great Commission of the Gospel of Matthew. The responsibility of the church is to go and make disciples. Go, evangelize, and make disciples. And that is a responsibility of the church. But it's not first. Jesus said something else that was even greater than the Great Commission. And don't take my word for it, take his. In the 22nd chapter of Matthew, somebody asked Jesus, what is the greatest commandment in the law? Referring to the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. What's the greatest commandment? Out of all the commands you've given, all the commands God's given his people, what is the greatest one? And Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And look at verse 38. This is the first and greatest commandment. The first and greatest. So the first and greatest responsibility of the church is to love God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our strength, with all our mind. That's our first responsibility. A.W. Tozier called it that we are called to have an everlasting preoccupation with God. That's the responsibility of the church, to be just continually preoccupied with God, who he is, what he's done, and why he's worthy of our worship. Paul, in the Corinthian letter, he said, everything you do, whatever you do it all for the glory of God. And that's why people talk about worship as all of life, because for a Christian, for a believer, all of life is about glorifying God. Our first responsibility is to lift up God by the things we think and the things we say and the things we do. We are lifting up God. We are drawing people to him. We do that in Sunday morning through what we just experienced, through what we're doing right now. We're trying to, my job and Scott's job is to kind of get out of the way and make God the star and the center of our attention in this time. But we also do that. So we do it on Sunday, but we also do it on Monday, and we do it on Tuesday. We do it at work, and we do it at school, and we do it in the stands on Friday night, and we do it when we're cheering for our favorite football team on Saturdays. We're always constantly lifting up God, and that's because of the second truth here, and that is we are all worshipers. We all worship. And this one, you may say the first responsibility of the church is worship, but now this one you might push back on a little bit, because I've had people tell me before, no, that's not me. I don't like the worship part of the service. No, people say that, and what they're talking about is the singing. I had somebody once tell me, I just don't like the singing. I think we sing too much at Murray Hills. We sing too many songs. And I was kind of confused, and I'm like, what are you talking about? He goes, I'd just rather hear you preach. I'd rather we sing less and you get to preach more. And I said, I know what you're talking about. You're a wise man, brother. Absolutely, that's what we should do. But what he was saying was, I'm not a worshiper. That's not true. He may not like to sing. You know, you can say that. I don't like to sing. But we all worship. Even if we're not a Christian, even if you're here in this room right now and you're like, well, I just came because they invited me, and I don't even know that I buy all this God stuff. I don't even know that I buy all this Jesus stuff. So I'm definitely not a worshiper. I just sat and watched while you guys did that. No, everybody, if you're human and you're breathing, you're a worshiper. We are all worshipers. And I'm stealing this idea from Louis, and he says it better than I can. So let me just read you a piece of what he says right here. This is how he defines it. He says, worship is our response to what we value most. That's why worship is that thing that we all do. It's what we are all about on any given day. Because worship is about saying, this person, this thing, this experience, this whatever is what matters most to me. This is the thing that I put first in my life. And that thing might be a relationship, it might be a dream, friends, status, stuff, a name, some kind of pleasure. Whatever name you put on it, this thing or person is what you have concluded in your heart is worth most to you. And whatever is worth most to you, you guessed it, is what you worship. Worship tells us what we value most, and as a result, worship determines our actions, becoming the driving force for all we do. And we're not just talking about the religious crowd. We're not just talking about Christians. We're talking about all of mankind, because as Louis says, everybody has an altar, and every altar has a throne. Think on that just a little bit. Everybody has an altar, and every altar has a throne. So worship is our response to what we value. So the things that we give our allegiance to, the things that we give our affection to, the things that we give our attention to, those are things that we value, and those are things that we worship. It may not look like worship, we may not call it worship, but those are things that we worship because we're responding to something. So the way we spend our time, the way we spend our money, the thing that receive, most of our love and our attention and our affection, those are things we worship. And so you start thinking about that in our context, and you say, well, yeah, we're all worshipers. Some of us worship our kids. I mean, that's become very popular in today's culture, that kids get elevated above everything else. Kids get elevated above the marriage, which is damaging a lot of marriages. But, I mean, that's that the kids, we worship our kids. And whatever they do, we just kind of bow, okay, whatever you did, whatever you say. Some of us, we worship our careers. And it's all about the status and the success and climbing the ladder and whatever, how much money we make and that kind of stuff. Some of us worship our favorite sports team. There was a lot of worship that took place yesterday. I participated in some of it. I'm just being honest. I participated in a lot of worship on my back porch yesterday. I watched the Tennessee game, and I watched the Kentucky game, and I watched a little bit of the Georgia game. I mean, there's a lot of worship in some big cathedrals, altars that we built here in the South to do that kind of worship. Some of us worship our social media platforms, which is really worshiping ourselves, if you think about it, which is kind of scary. But we worship the likes we get and those kinds of things. Some of us worship Fortnite. Yeah, we do. And if you don't know what that is, ask your grandchildren, okay? But some of us worship that because that's what gets the majority of our time, and that's what gets the majority of our attention, and that's what gets our affection. Now, is there anything wrong with Fortnite? No. Is there anything wrong with SEC football? No. Is there anything wrong with my kids? No. The question is, who is supposed to take supremacy in my worship? There is an order to things. And this is... Louis talks about, I listened to this on Thursday. So on Thursday I was running and I was listening to a podcast and they were interviewing him about worship. And he started the Passion Movement. I don't know how many of you guys have heard of the Passion Movement, but they fill stadiums with college students. And it's just incredible. A lot of our worship music comes from the Passion Conference. So Giglio's had a major impact on worship. And he says a lot of pastors come to him and say, how do I make our congregation come more alive in worship? How do we, I just want people to experience who God is. I just want people to respond. I don't just want them to stand there with their arms crossed and sing. I want a man somewhere to lift up hands to God. And Louis said that inevitably that same man, and I'm that man, Well, that same man will say, but that's just not me. That's just not what I do. I mean, that may be you and that's your personality, but I don't do that. And Louis' answer to it is, really? Because I was behind you at the Kentucky game when they scored the go-ahead touchdown with no time on the clock, and I could swear I saw both of your hands go up like this. I'm almost positive it was you. And you were hugging the guy next to you, and you didn't even know that guy. And you dropped your beer, and you were high-fiving everybody and fist-bumping everybody. And it may not have been you. I mean, you may have just been sitting there going, well, that was good. Good job, Kentucky. I'm celebrating in my heart. That may have been you, but I'm almost positive that you had your fist raised. And when I saw that image of you, I didn't think, oh, no, look at here. He's gone charismatic on us. Oh, no, look at here. He's super serious. What I saw was a human celebrating something of value to them. And he said, we're all objects of worship. We all worship whenever you put the right object of worship in front of us. And that thought has been, all day yesterday when I watched that, they've got a camera in the end zone that will show what happens after a team scores, and inevitably after a team scores, everybody goes straight up like that. I was watching that. I started looking for examples of that this morning, and I ran across this one, and look at this picture right here. This is amazing. If you took the athlete out of the foreground, look what's going on in the background. What does that look like? It looks like worship, doesn't it? Except for the guy in the red. He's Church of Christ. But everybody else, he's actually getting ready to serve the table. And you got to be Church of Christ to catch that one. I'm sorry. But sorry. But when we see things that are good, when we see things that we value, we respond to those things, and that's natural. That's a human response. So the question isn't, are we worshiping or are we worshipers? The question is, who is worthy of our worship? Who is most worthy of our worship? That's fine. If you want to cheer for the Minnesota Vikings when they score a touchdown, go for it. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with being a Kentucky fan and cheering for Kentucky. It's questionable, but there's not wrong. It's not wrong, okay? There's nothing wrong with cheering for your kids and wanting to see them succeed and wanting to pour time into their lives. But there's an order to things. So who is most worthy of our worship? Is there one who is more worthy than all others? And the answer, of course, is yes. And one of the places the Bible talks about this is in Colossians, beginning in chapter 1. And this is what Paul says about Jesus. Now pay attention here. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. So God, we don't see God. We can't see God. God is invisible. But how do we know what God is like? Through Jesus. We know what God is like because God revealed himself through the person of Jesus. Now, a lot of us think, well, God is like this angry old judge and Jesus is this loving son, and that's not accurate. Because God revealed himself through the loving Son. God revealed himself through sacrifice. So that's who God is. So the Son is the image of the invisible God. For in him all things were created. Things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him, and those last three words, and for him. And so that means the reason we are all worshipers is because we were created by God for worship. We were created for God. I mean, think about this. We were created to worship. In fact, all of creation was made to worship the Creator. That's what this series, So Will I, is about. If the stars were made to worship, so will I. If the mountains were made to worship, so will I. If the rocks cry out in worship, so will I. So all of creation is made to worship the Creator. And then look how he continues here, verse 17. He, Jesus, is before all things, and in him all things hold together. So when things start to break apart, it could be that our attentions have become divided. It could be that our allegiances have become divided. It could be that our affections have become divided. It could be that we practice idolatry. And we say, oh, no, we don't do that anymore. I mean, the Hebrews did that way back in the Old Testament, but we don't practice idolatry today. We'll talk more about that, okay? Jesus holds things together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have supremacy. In everything he might have supremacy. So what we do on Sundays, he has to be first and foremost what it's about. And what we do on Mondays, he has to be first and foremost what it's about. What we do on Tuesday, you get the picture. He has supremacy because worship is our response to what we value most. Or we should say worship is our response to who we value most. So here's the definition that we're going to work with. I don't know if I lost it in there somehow. Whoops, sorry about that. Here's the definition that we're going to work with in this series. And in the next 4 weeks, we're going to break this definition down and talk about it. But it expands it just a little. So worship is our response to what we value most. But let's expand that just a little bit, okay? So worship is our response, both personal and corporate, meaning through what we do with our lives individually, but also what we do together when we gather, personal and corporate, to God for who he is and what he has done, expressed in and by the things we say and the way we live. So worship's our response to God, personal and corporate, our response to God, who he is and what he's done, expressed both in and by the things we say and the way we live. The next 4 weeks, we're going to dig deeper and deeper and deeper into that definition.